The air in the gilded spoon always felt different from the outside world. It was heavier, thick with the scent of roasted garlic, expensive perfume, and the low, constant hum of people who were used to getting what they wanted. For Clara, it was the soundtrack to her nights. She moved through the large dining room not like a person, but like a part of the machinery. Her feet, tucked into sensible black shoes, knew the floor's every dip and groove by heart. They could navigate the path from table 7 to the kitchen, even with her eyes closed. A skill she'd unfortunately perfected over the last 2 years, her uniform. A crisp white blouse and a long black skirt felt like a costume. It wasn't her. When she put it on, she felt like she was tucking away the real Clara, the one who used to laugh with her whole body and who thought in melodies. The woman who carried a tray laden with lobster bisque and filet mignon was a creation of necessity. She had a polite, practiced smile that she could switch on and off like a light. And her voice, when she took orders, was soft and agreeable, a voice that never caused any trouble. "And for you, sir?" "Certainly, ma'am. Right away." These phrases were her mantras, repeated until they lost all meaning. Tonight was particularly busy. A Saturday. The worst kind of busy, filled with couples on fancy dates and groups of friends celebrating something or other. Their laughter echoing off the high ceilings adorned with fancy chandeliers. Clara's back ached with a familiar dull throb, constant companion that started around 8 p.m. and didn't leave until she was finally home, soaking her feet in a basin of hot water. She balanced a heavy tray on one hand, her muscles tight and screaming in protest. On it were 4 glasses of champagne, the bubbles rising in tiny, frantic golden chains. She delivered them to a table of young women, all dressed up and sparkling, their faces bright with excitement. As she set the glasses down, one of them said, "Thank you so much," without really looking at her. Clara just nodded and moved on. She was invisible, a ghost in a black apron. But she saw everything. She saw the way the man at table 12 kept checking his phone under the table, his face tight with anxiety. She saw the elderly couple in the corner, holding hands across the tablecloth, their silence more intimate than any conversation. She saw the life happening all around her, a rich tapestry of human emotion. And she felt like a spectator at a play she could never be a part of. Her own life felt paused, put on a shelf while she played this role. Her eyes, as they so often did, drifted to the far corner of the room. And there it was. The grand piano. It was a magnificent beast of black lacquered wood and gleaming ivory keys, sitting under a soft spotlight like a performer waiting for its cue. It was the most expensive, most beautiful, and most painful thing in the entire restaurant. The management called it a statement piece, something to add to the ambiance. Most nights, it just sat there, silent and still, collecting dust motes in the light. To the wealthy patrons, it was just furniture, as much a part of the room as the velvet curtains or the abstract paintings on the wall. To Clara, it was a tombstone for the girl she used to be. She could almost feel the ghost of her younger self sitting on that worn leather bench, her fingers hovering over the keys, ready to bring the room to life. She remembered the weight of her fingers on the ivory, the way the vibrations would travel up her arms and into her soul. Music for her wasn't just sound. It was color, it was feeling, it was the purest form of language. A fast run of notes was a silver waterfall. A deep, resonant chord was a warm hug. A melancholy melody was a gray, rainy afternoon. She remembered being 10 years old, her feet dangling from the piano bench at home, her mother sitting beside her. Her mother's hands, soft and smelling of lavender, would gently guide her fingers into the correct position. "No, not so stiff, my love," her mother would whisper. "Let the music flow through you. Don't force it." And she would try so hard to relax, to let the notes become an extension of her thoughts. She remembered the pride in her father's eyes when she played her first piece at a school recital. It's a simple little tune, but she had played it perfectly, her heart thumping a wild rhythm against her ribs. The applause had felt like sunshine. Those memories were a double-edged sword. They were beautiful, a warm blanket on a cold night, but they also brought a sharp, piercing pain. Because that girl with the proud parents and the future full of promise, was gone. The path she had been on, the one paved with sheet music and the scent of rosin, had crumbled beneath her feet. Life had thrown a curveball so fast and so hard, it had knocked the wind right out of her. It wasn't a dramatic, scandalous story. It was just life. A series of quiet, desperate events that had led her here to this restaurant, wearing a costume and serving champagne to people who didn't see her. She had a scholarship to a prestigious music school. She had dreams of concert halls, of making people feel what she felt when she played. But then her mother got sick. The medical bills piled up like mountains of paper, each one a new weight on her shoulders. The scholarship didn't cover everything, and her father's small salary wasn't enough. Clara had made a choice, a quiet, heartbreaking choice. She had packed her sheet music away, sold the keyboard she had saved up for, and found the first job that would hire her, a job that paid the bills. The gilded spoon. The irony wasn't lost on her. Sometimes, late at night when the restaurant was empty and she was finishing her side work, she would allow herself a few moments. She would walk over to the piano, her heart beating a little faster. She would run a finger lightly over the keys, not pressing them down, just touching them like a farewell. It was a small, secret ritual, a way of reminding herself that part of her was still in there, buried under the exhaustion and the disappointment. Tonight, as she cleared a table near the piano, she was close enough to smell the faint, woody scent of the polished wood. An older gentleman, a regular who always sat alone, watched her. He was a quiet man who usually just read a book while he ate his soup. Tonight, however, he was looking right at her. "It's a shame," he said, his voice raspy but kind. Such a beautiful instrument just sitting there, gathering dust. Clara froze for a second, her hand holding a stack of dirty plates. She felt a jolt, as if he had read her mind. She forced a small smile. "Yes, sir. It is. It must be lonely," the man continued, looking at the piano. "To have all that music inside you, and no one to let it out." Clara's breath caught in her throat. All that music inside you. He had no idea how true those words were, or how deeply they cut. She felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to sit down right there and then, to lift the lid and play until her fingers bled and her heart was empty. But she couldn't. The Clara who did that was a ghost. This Clara had dirty plates to take to the kitchen. She just nodded again, unable to trust her own voice, and hurried away. The man's words echoing in her long after she had pushed through the swinging doors into the hot, noisy kitchen. The ghost of the piano and the girl who used to play it followed her. The quiet rhythm of the restaurant was a fragile thing. It was built on soft-spoken orders, the gentle clinking of silverware, and the respectful distance between tables. That rhythm was shattered just after 9 o'clock when the door swung open with a burst of cool night air and a wave of energy that didn't belong. A group of 5 people strode in, led by a man who seemed to take up more space than his physical form should allow. It wasn't that he was overly large, but his presence was a force field, pushing and pulling at the room's delicate atmosphere. This was Julian Sterling, a name whispered in financial circles and splashed across tech blogs. He was a man who had built an empire from ones and zeros, and now he seemed to be collecting experiences with the same fervor. Clara was refilling the water glasses at table 9 when she saw them. The mater d', a usually unflappable man named Robert, practically scurried from his podium, a tight, professional smile plastered on his face. "Mr. Sterling, welcome. Of course, your table is ready." He led them to the best spot in the house, a large circular table near the window that offered a view of the city lights. The group settled in, their laughter already louder than anyone else's. They pulled out expensive-looking phones, took pictures of their cocktails, and spoke in a way that demanded attention. The rest of the dining room reacted like a pond to a dropped stone. Conversations quieted. People glanced over, trying not to stare but failing. Clara felt the shift in the air like a change in pressure. It meant more work, more demands, and a higher chance of things going wrong. She watched them from a distance as she went about her duties. Julian Sterling was the center of their universe. He leaned back in his chair, one arm draped casually over the back, telling a story that had his companions in stitches. He had an easy, confident charm, but there was something else there too. A restless energy in his eyes, as if he was constantly scanning the room for the next thing to capture his interest, which was a very short-lived commodity. He had everything a person could buy. And now he was in the business of buying moments of amusement. Clara's manager, a thin, anxious man named David, pulled her aside near the kitchen. "You're on the Sterling table," he said in a low, urgent voice. "Be fast, be perfect, and be invisible unless you're needed. They are big tippers, but they are also particular." Clara just nodded. She knew the drill. Some tables wanted a friend, others wanted a robot. This group clearly wanted a high-end robot. She approached the table with her practiced smile firmly in place. "Good evening. Can I start you with something to drink?" Her voice was smooth and neutral. Julian Sterling looked up, and for a second, his eyes met hers. It was a quick, assessing glance, the kind a person gives a piece of furniture they're considering buying. Then he looked away, already back in his own world, and rattled off an order for a bottle of wine that cost more than Clara's monthly rent. The rest of the group followed suit. Clara wrote it all down, her hands steady, and retreated to the bar. The evening progressed. The Sterling party was a whirlwind of appetizers, multiple main courses, and a lot of loud, boastful conversation. Clara moved around them like a ghost, refilling wine glasses, clearing plates, and bringing new courses, all while trying to remain a part of the background. She heard snippets of their talk about stock options, a recent trip to a private island, a new yacht. It was a different world, a language she didn't speak. She felt the familiar pang of resentment, hot and sharp in her chest, and quickly pushed it down. It was a useless emotion. By the time they were on their dessert and coffee course, the initial buzz of their arrival had worn off for the rest of the restaurant. The other patrons had turned back to their own conversations, and the room had found a new, slightly louder equilibrium. But Julian Sterling was clearly getting bored again. He pushed his half-eaten plate of chocolate lava cake away and sighed dramatically, leaning back in his chair. He scanned the room, his eyes restless, searching. They passed over the other diners, the paintings on the wall, the bar, and then they landed on the grand piano, sitting silently in its corner. A slow, mischievous smile spread across his face. He had found his new amusement. He turned his head, his eyes scanning the staff, and they landed on Clara, who was clearing a nearby table. He raised a hand and crooked a finger, a gesture that was both simple and incredibly commanding. Clara's heart sank. She looked at her manager, who gave her a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. "Go." She pasted on her smile and walked over to the table, her stomach tightening with every step. "Yes, sir? Was everything to your satisfaction?" "Oh, everything was fine," he said, his voice dripping with a casual power. "But I'm a little bored." "We're a little bored." He gestured to his companions, who all nodded with eager, expectant looks. "And I'm looking for some entertainment." His eyes flicked towards the piano, then back to her. "You, that piano. Do you play?" The question hung in the air, sudden and sharp. The nearby tables fell silent. Clara felt a hot flush creep up her neck. She could feel the weight of dozens of curious eyes turning in her direction. Her mind went blank for a second. "I used to," she stammered, the words barely audible. "Used to?" Sterling leaned forward, his smile widening. He was enjoying this. He was a predator who had just spotted a flicker of weakness. "That's not a yes or a no." Let the silence stretch, making her squirm. "Look, I'll make it interesting. I'm a man who likes to make things interesting." He pulled a thick wallet from his jacket pocket and casually placed it on the table. "I dare you to play something for us. Right now." A ripple of cruel amusement went through his party. One of the women giggled behind her hand. This wasn't a request. It was a setup. It was a game where she was the unwilling pawn, designed for their private entertainment. Humiliation coiled in Clara's gut. She wanted to turn around and walk away, to tell him what he could do with his dare. But she was frozen, trapped by his gaze and the silent judgment of the room. "If you can play anything more impressive than chopsticks," he continued, his voice loud enough for the tables around them to hear, "I'll give you $1,000, cash." He pulled out a crisp $100 bill and fanned it with his fingers. Right here, right now. $1,000. The number hit Clara with the force of a physical blow. It was a life-changing amount of money for her. It was the rent, the overdue electricity bill, and a new pair of shoes for her worn-out feet, all in one. It was a small piece of security, a tiny cushion against the hard edges of her life. But it wasn't about the money, not really. It was about the way he was looking at her. The smug certainty on his face that she was just a simple waitress, a nobody who couldn't possibly have any real talent. He was testing her, and in his mind, she had already failed. She looked at his face, then at the expectant faces of his friends. She saw the manager out of the corner of her eye, his face pale with panic, gesturing for her to make an excuse to de-escalate. She thought of the old man's words from earlier in the evening. It must be lonely to have all that music inside you and no one to let it out. The music inside her, it wasn't just a memory. It was still there, dormant, sleeping under layers of exhaustion and disappointment. And this man, this arrogant, bored millionaire, was poking at it with a stick, thinking it was a dead thing. Clara stood there, the silence pressing in on her. The restaurant was waiting. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, a wild, frantic drumbeat. The dare was hanging in the air between them, a golden, glittering, humiliating trap. And she had to decide whether to walk away or step inside. Clara stood frozen, a statue in the middle of a bustling restaurant. The world seemed to slow down, the sounds around her stretching and distorting like a recording played at the wrong speed. The clinking of a fork against a plate was a sharp, metallic clang. A woman's laugh from across the room was a high, piercing note. But the loudest sound was the frantic, thumping beat of her own heart, a drum solo of pure panic playing just for her. All eyes were on her. She could feel their gazes like a physical weight pressing down on her shoulders, making it hard to breathe. Her mind was a battlefield, torn between two powerful, screaming impulses. The first one screamed, "Run! Just turn around. Walk away. Don't give this man the satisfaction." It was the voice of self-preservation, the voice that had kept her safe for the last 2 years. This voice pointed toward the swinging kitchen doors, which suddenly looked like the gates to a sanctuary. In there were hot plates, sharp knives, and the familiar, chaotic rhythm of a busy kitchen. In there, she was not on display. She was just part of the crew, invisible and safe. If she walked away now, she would be embarrassed, yes, but the feeling would fade. Tomorrow, she would come back to work, and this would just be a story she told. Horrible, cringeworthy memory. She caught a glimpse of her manager, David, standing near the bar. His face was pale, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and pleading. He was making tiny, frantic gestures with his hands, a silent mime begging her to refuse. He was thinking about the restaurant's reputation, about a potentially angry and influential customer. He was thinking about his job. He wanted her to be the good employee, the one who de-escalates, who apologizes and disappears. The voice in her head that sounded like him said, "Make an excuse. Tell him your hands are dirty. Tell him you're not allowed. Just end it." But then there was the other voice. This one was quieter, but it was stronger. It wasn't a scream. It was a deep, resonant hum that came from somewhere in her chest. This voice didn't talk about running. It talked about the $1,000. In Clara's mind, desperate for a logical reason to consider such a crazy idea, latched onto that number. $1,000. It wasn't just a number. It was real, tangible things. It was the stack of final notices on her kitchen counter, the ones she couldn't bear to look at. It was the sound of her landlord's voice on the phone, patient but firm. It was the leaky faucet in her bathroom that dripped a steady, maddening rhythm all night long. It was the worn-out soles of her work shoes, the thin fabric offering no protection from the hard floor. $1,000 was a month of peace. It was the ability to buy groceries without counting every penny. It was a lifeline thrown to her in the most humiliating way possible. But as she stood there, the money started to feel less like the prize and more like an excuse. The real fuel for the quiet voice was the anger. It was a slow, burning fire that had been smoldering inside her for a long time. and Julian Sterling's dare had just thrown a bucket of gasoline on it. She looked at his face, at the smug, lazy smile playing on his lips. He wasn't just a bored man looking for entertainment. He was a bully. He saw her uniform, her tired eyes, and he had made an assumption. He had decided she was a nobody, a simple waitress whose life was so small that a public dare, a wad of cash, would be the most exciting thing to happen to her all year. He was reducing her entire existence, her dreams, her past, her talent, to a party trick for his amusement. And in that moment, something inside her snapped. It wasn't a loud crack, but a quiet, clean break. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was no longer in charge. The anger was warm and powerful. It was the anger of a 10-year-old girl who practiced for hours until her fingers were sore. It was the anger of a teenager who dreamed of concert halls. It was the anger of a young woman who had packed her sheet music away, not because she wanted to, but because she had to. Who was this man to come in here and poke at that wound? Who was he to decide what she was or wasn't capable of? She thought of the old man from earlier, his kind eyes and his gentle voice. It must be lonely to have all that music inside you and no one to let it out. He was right. It was lonely. It was a constant, quiet ache. And walking away from this piano, from this chance, even a chance born from a cruel dare, would be like agreeing to be lonely forever. It would be letting Julian Sterling win. It would be letting him seal the tomb on the girl she used to be. The humiliation of playing badly and failing seemed suddenly small compared to the humiliation of not even trying. The regret would be a heavier burden than the embarrassment. She could fail tonight, and she would cry about it later, and she would still have to come to work tomorrow. But if she walked away, she would always wonder. She would always have this moment in her head, this chance she was too scared to take. That was a prison she didn't want to live in. Clara took a deep breath. It was the first real full breath she had taken since he had called her over. The air filled her lungs, and with it came a strange sense of calm. The battlefield in her mind went quiet. The decision was made. She wasn't doing this for the $1,000 anymore. She was doing it for the girl with the proud father. She was doing it for the mother who smelled of lavender. She was doing it for herself. She didn't look at her manager. She didn't look at the other tables. She looked directly at Julian Sterling, and for the first time that night, her eyes were not soft or polite. They were clear and steady. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't a nod of agreement or submission. It was a nod of acknowledgement. A simple statement, game on. Then she turned. The journey from the center of the room to the piano in the corner was the longest walk of her life. Every step was deliberate. She could feel the silence of the room following her, a heavy, living thing. She was no longer invisible. She was the focal point, the main event. She heard a soft gasp from one table, a whisper from another. The floorboards seemed to creak louder under her feet. She kept her eyes fixed on the piano, on its black lacquered shine, on the promise it held. It was no longer a tombstone. It was a stage. As she reached it, she ran her hand gently over the smooth, cool wood of the lid. It felt like greeting an old friend. She pulled out the heavy, leather-topped bench, the scrape of its legs against the hardwood floor, echoing in the silent room. She sat down, the familiar feel of the bench under her thighs instantly grounding her. She straightened her back, a posture she hadn't felt in years. The posture of a performer, not a server. She lifted her hands and placed them gently on the keys, her fingers hovering just above the ivory. The room was holding its breath. Julian Sterling was watching, his smirk finally gone, replaced by a look of keen, curious anticipation. Clara didn't see him anymore. She didn't see the crowd or the restaurant. Her world had shrunk to the 88 keys in front of her. The music was no longer inside her, begging to be let out. It was right here, waiting, and she was ready to set it free. The moment her fingers touched the cool ivory keys, the world around Clara began to fade. The first few notes she played were soft, almost hesitant. It was a simple melody, a gentle lullaby she remembered from a time that felt like a lifetime ago. The sound was clear and pure, but it was nothing spectacular. From his table, the millionaire who had dared her let out a soft chuckle. Leaning over to whisper something to the woman beside him, she could guess what he was thinking. See? Just a simple waitress playing a simple tune? A few of his friends snickered. The rest of the diners, who had paused their conversations out of curiosity, began to turn back to their meals, the brief moment of excitement over. But Clara wasn't playing for them. Not yet. She was playing for herself, for the ghost of the little girl whose feet used to dangle from that very same piano bench. She was letting her fingers remember the feel of the keys, reacquainting herself with an old friend she had missed desperately. The simple melody was a hello, a quiet greeting. And then her hands began to move. The gentle lullaby started to twist. A new note was added here, a complex harmony there. The simple tune began to grow, to take on a life of its own. It was like watching a black and white photograph slowly fill in with color. The melody was still there, but it was now wrapped in layers of intricate classical beauty. Her fingers, which had seemed so tentative just moments before, began to dance across the keys with a precision that was breathtaking. They flew, they leaped, they caressed. Each note perfect and placed with intention. The chuckles from the millionaire's table died in their throats. A fork, halfway to a man's mouth, stopped in midair. The woman who had been whispering to her companion now stared, her mouth slightly agape. The gentle background music had transformed into something else entirely. It was demanding, captivating. It pulled the attention of everyone in the room, not with volume, but with its sheer, undeniable beauty. Then, just as the audience was settling into this new classical world, Clara changed the game again. A syncopated rhythm, a cool, bluesy note slipped into the melody. The music started to argue with itself. A playful tug-of-war between the structured classical notes and the free-spirited, soulful sound of jazz. It was a conversation. A story of two different worlds trying to find a way to exist together. Her left hand laid down a steady, walking bass line, while her right hand spun out melodies that were sometimes elegant and sometimes raw and crying. It was the sound of her own life. The conflict between the disciplined musician she was trained to be and the weary, heartbroken woman she had become. She was no longer in the restaurant. She had her eyes closed now, her body swaying slightly with the music. She was back in her old living room, her mother's hands guiding hers. She was in a practice room at the music school, the smell of old wood and rosin in the air. She was in her tiny apartment late at night, with tears streaming down her face as she silently tapped out melodies on her knees because she had no piano to play. All the joy, all the pain, all the frustration and longing she had kept locked away for so long was pouring out of her, through her fingers and into the keys. It was the most honest thing she had ever done. The music began to build. The quiet conversation between the classical and the blues turned into a passionate debate. The tempo quickened. The volume grew. Her hands were a blur, a storm of motion across the keyboard. The sound was no longer just beautiful. It was powerful. It filled every corner of the room, vibrating through the floor, through the tables, through the bones of everyone listening. It was a wave of sound, and it was lifting everyone up, carrying them away with it. The old man who had spoken to her earlier had his eyes closed, a single tear tracing a path down his wrinkled cheek. The chef had come out of the kitchen, standing in the doorway, wiping his hands on his apron, his face a mask of pure awe. The millionaire was leaning forward in his chair, his elbows on the table, his eyes wide and fixed on Clara. The smug look was gone, wiped away, and replaced by an expression of utter, complete disbelief. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost he had inadvertently summoned himself. Clara's entire being was focused on the music. Her back ached, her fingers were starting to cramp, but she didn't feel it. All she felt was the release. It was like a dam inside her had broken, and years of unshed tears were flooding out, not as water, but as sound. The music was her anger at the unfairness of life, her sadness for her lost dreams, her love for the parent she had tried so hard to protect, and a tiny, flickering spark of hope that she thought had been extinguished long ago. The crescendo was immense. It was a thundering, roaring, magnificent storm of sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. It was every emotion she had ever felt, all at once, all screaming to be heard. It was the sound of a soul being laid bare. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. She brought her hands down on the keys for one final, resonant chord that seemed to hang in the air like a star. It was a sound so full and so powerful that it echoed in the silence that followed. And then there was nothing. Absolute, profound silence. No one moved. No one spoke. No one clapped. The entire restaurant was frozen, held captive in the wake of what they had just witnessed. The air was thick with emotion, with the ghost of the music that had just filled it. It was as if everyone had collectively forgotten how to breathe, how to think, how to do anything but listen to the ringing in their ears and the beating of their own hearts. They were, as the title had promised, completely and utterly speechless. Clara sat on the bench, her chest heaving, her hands trembling as they rested on the keys. She slowly opened her eyes, the spell broken. She looked out at the room, at the faces staring back at her, and for a moment, she didn't know where she was. She saw the shocked faces, the teary eyes, the open mouths. She saw the millionaire, his face pale and humbled, and she realized what she had done. She had let the music out, and in doing so, she had finally let herself out too. The silence that followed Clara's final chord was a living thing. It was heavy and thick, filling the space where the music had just been. It wasn't an empty silence. It was a full one, vibrating with the memory of the sound that had just shaken the room. People were frozen, forks suspended in midair, glasses halfway to their lips. It was as if time had stopped and everyone was trapped in the moment just after the storm, waiting for the world to start turning again. Clara sat on the bench, her hands resting on the keys, her own breathing loud in her ears. She felt hollowed out, like a shell that had been washed clean by a powerful wave. She was exhausted, but it was a good kind of exhaustion, kind that comes after a hard, honest work. The spell was finally broken by a single, slow clap. It came from the old man in the corner, the one who had spoken to her earlier. His hands came together, one soft, deliberate sound at a time. Then another person joined in, a woman from a table by the window. Then another and another. The sound grew slowly at first, then faster, until it was a wave of applause that swept through the entire restaurant. It wasn't just polite clapping. It was loud, enthusiastic, and filled with a raw emotion. People began to stand up one by one, then in groups, until the entire dining room was on its feet. The sound was overwhelming, a thunderous roar of appreciation that washed over Clara. She looked out at the sea of faces. All turned towards her, their expressions a mixture of awe, respect, and sheer amazement. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and sudden. She had never in her life felt so seen, so understood. She wasn't a waitress anymore. She wasn't a ghost. She was the artist who had just poured her heart out, and they had felt every single note. Through the wall of sound, a figure began to move towards the piano. It was Julian, the millionaire. His face was no longer smug or amused. It was pale, his eyes wide with a look of profound humility. He walked slowly, as if in a daze, the crowd parting for him. He stopped in front of the piano, the applause still echoing around him. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a thick, white envelope. He placed it on the piano, but his gesture was different now. It wasn't a payment. It was an offering. He then leaned in, his voice low and sincere, a stark contrast to the loud, boisterous tone he had used earlier. "Forget the $1,000, he said, his voice barely a whisper, but it cut through the noise with perfect clarity. That was the most incredible thing I have ever heard. I am so sorry." The apology was unexpected, and it hit Clara with the force of another chord. He wasn't just talking about the dare. He was apologizing for underestimating her, for seeing her as a prop for his entertainment. "I was a fool," he continued, his eyes fixed on hers. "I saw a uniform, and I made a judgment. I had no idea." He shook his head as if trying to clear it. "That music, it wasn't just a performance. It was a story. You have a gift, a truly rare and beautiful gift. It doesn't belong in a restaurant, gathering dust." He paused, then pulled a small, elegant business card case from his other pocket. He took out a card and held it out to her. "My foundation, we fund emerging artists. Musicians, painters, writers, we look for raw, undeniable talent." And what I just heard, it was the definition of that. Clara looked at the card, then back at his face. She was still in a daze, her mind struggling to catch up with the reality of the situation. An hour ago, she was clearing plates and trying to be invisible. Now, a man who held the power to change her life was standing in front of her, offering her a chance she had only dreamed of. "I want to set up a meeting for you," he said, his voice gaining a bit of its old confidence. But it was a kinder, more respectful confidence now. "With the best music producers in the city, people who can help you. No strings attached. No obligations. Just a chance to play for them, to let them hear what I just heard." He pushed the card a little closer. "You belong on a stage, not serving tables. Please, let me help you get there." Clara slowly reached out and took the card. It was heavy, made of thick, cream-colored stock with his name and a simple, elegant logo printed on it. It felt solid, real, like a key to a door she thought had been locked forever. She looked down at her own hands, the hands that had just created that storm of music. They were trembling slightly, but they looked different to her now. They weren't just hands for carrying trays and wiping down tables. They were instruments. They were powerful. The applause was finally starting to die down, but people were still standing, still looking at her with warm, encouraging smiles. Her manager was standing near the bar, his face a picture of shock and pride. The chef was still there in the kitchen doorway, giving her a thumbs up. The whole world had shifted on its axis in the span of 10 minutes. She looked at Julian, at the genuine, earnest look in his eyes. The dare had been born from arrogance, but his apology and his offer were born from genuine respect. He had been changed by the music, just as everyone else in the room had been. And in that moment, Clara realized that the dare, as humiliating as it had been a gift. It had been the push she needed, the spark that had ignited the dry tinder of her soul. It had forced her to remember who she was. She took a deep, shaky breath and looked him directly in the eye. "Okay," she said, her voice soft but clear. "I'll do it." A wide, genuine smile broke across Julian's face. "You won't regret it," he said. "I promise." He straightened up and turned back to his table where his friends were watching with their own looks of amazement. The room began to slowly come back to life, the spell finally broken. People started to sit down, their conversations now buzzing with excitement. It's all about the waitress who could play the piano. Clara sat there for a moment longer, the card clutched in her hand. She looked at the piano, her old friend, her tormentor, and now her savior. She gently closed the lid over the keys, a quiet final gesture. She was no longer the girl who packed her dreams away. She was the woman who had just taken the first step to getting them back. She stood up from the bench, her back straight, her head held high. She was still wearing her uniform, but it didn't feel like a costume anymore. It was just something she was wearing for a little while longer. Because she knew, with a certainty that filled her entire being, that she would not be a waitress for much longer. Her life had just begun again.